One very specific fear I used to have when playing chess was having to trade one of my rooks for two of my opponent's minor pieces. And like logically, I knew that the two minor pieces technically together were worth more than the rook, but in practice, it can sometimes be hard to pull off. So in this video, I'm going to show you kind of recent examples of when I had the two minor pieces against the one rook, and kind of give you the tips and tricks to be able to win this endgame if you get down into positions like this. So when you have the minor pieces, the one thing you always want to be keeping an eye out for is a way to actually win the rook, because then you'll just have an extra piece and hopefully you should be able to win that endgame, right? Okay, we have a light squared bishop, right? If the king is ever on a light square and the rook is ever on a light square, that might be a perfect situation for either a bishop fork or a skewer or a pin. But if you're the player with the rook, you can do your due diligence by looking at the kind of bishop that your opponent has and just keeping your king and rook on opposite colored squares, or hopefully just keeping them off the color complex of that bishop in the first place. The other thing is you don't want your two minor pieces doing the same job. So you don't want both of them tied down to defending one pawn, or you don't want both of them going after one pawn if they don't need to. You can also use your king as an attacking piece. And when you do have pawns left on the board, a lot of times you want to try and force your pawns and your opponent's pawns, if possible, onto the same color complex as your bishop. So in this game, I played b5. This is putting a pawn on that light square, right? My opponent went after it. And the other thing is you really want your minor pieces to be as active as possible, because when the situation arises that you might be able to win a piece, if your minor pieces are off in the corner, you might not be able to jump in time, right? So I didn't really want to play this move. I would actually rather take care of some of these scarier pawns over on the other side of the board. So bishop d1, and my thought was that if the rook captured on b5, I could capture on e2, and then, I'd also be attacking this. My opponent would have to come over here, bring the rook over and kind of tie it down to defending that. I could start bringing my king in, and then suddenly all their pawns are on light squares and we're having a great day, right? So let's see how this game went. Rook b7, I captured on e2, now just defending that b pawn. Rook takes f7, bishop takes f3, and now h4. And another problem is, even if your opponent's pawns aren't on the light squares, if they're creating holes around their position on those light squares, that can also be a problem. And that is demonstrated just a couple moves later when my opponent went here. I brought my bishop back to c4, just kind of linking the pawn and the bishop together so they're defending each other. And now everything's tied down and white really doesn't have a way to make progress. And this is exactly where they blundered. They brought the rook up to that dark square. Even if you're keeping your pieces on the opposite squares of the bishop, you still got to look out for that knight. And I played knight g4 and the game was over. Check, and we're winning the rook. So kind of the problem with having just the rook versus the two minor pieces is you have to be looking out for both of their threats, right? You have to be looking out for knight checks or knight forks, and you also have to be looking out that the bishop can't somehow skewer or pin or fork you. Let's take a look at this position. We have the black pieces again, and my opponent offered a queen trade here, and I was like, sure. White's up some pawns here, but the minor pieces together can be tricky enough to overcome even that. I jump my knight into the center, the rook gets involved, moving the king up to make sure that the king is also getting involved as much as possible. Defensive piece and attacking piece sometimes. I brought my knight up, and there are a lot of threats here. King can't go here because I'm forking, and I'm also attacking this a-pawn. And white chose to defend the a-pawn by moving it forward, but I was actually able to just give the check with the bishop anyway. The king, no matter where it moves, is going to get forked. So if it moves to this dark square, which is what happened in the game, I was able to fork like this. And funnily enough, same thing happens if it goes back to the corner, then I'm able to fork like this. So my opponent picked their poison, I got the rook, picked it up with the knight, and now I get to use my bishop to convert this endgame. And the idea when you're just up a piece, by the way, this is kind of outside the scope of this video, but you want to use your king and your piece sometimes in tandem to win a pawn like this if it's being defended by the king, and sometimes you want to use them for separate instances. So like right now, I'm bringing my king over to make sure that there's no pawns being promoted over on this side of the board, and just holding everything together so that my own pawn is able to promote eventually after I'm done winning the other pawns. So I hope these two examples helped convince you to look for the trickiness in the position when you are the person who has the extra minor pieces as opposed to the rook. And if you find yourself on the side of the rook, good luck. No, I'm just kidding. Sometimes it works out, but you really have to be careful, and you have to use the pawns that you have left to your advantage. You have to look for ways to bring your rook down and potentially fork one of your opponent's pieces with their king or one of the pieces with the other piece. There are ways to pick up material, but I hope this helped you. If you had the same fear that I did, get over your fear of having the 2 minor pieces against the rook, because it's actually a very fun endgame to learn and to play. So thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please do consider subscribing. It really does help me out a lot, and I will see you soon.